Most people are familiar with the story of the Exodus as told in the Bible or depicted in various pop culture renditions. An oppressed multitude of Jewish slaves are led by Moses out of Egypt. They flee across the parted Red Sea to freedom and eventually make their way to the Promised Land. I've explored some of the historical problems with the Exodus narrative in past episodes on this series, but what happened once they arrived in Canaan? Well, according to the Bible, the Israelites swept through the land and dealt the natives a heaping helping of genocide. If you assume that the biblical narrative is true, then first you have to realize that this is all one connected story.
We need to remember that this is one story from the Exodus from Egypt to the Conquest of Canaan. The beginning and the end. You cannot separate them.
If the biblical story of the Exodus and Conquest of Canaan is historical, then not only does all the archaeological evidence at these locations and the surrounding regions need to fit the biblical account, but the dates have to line up relative to each other and also fit the biblical timeline. For example, if the Bible says that the Israelites under Joshua conquered all of Canaan after leaving Egypt, then even if you find evidence of Semitic people leaving Egypt and you find evidence for all of the cities and their destruction, if they were destroyed before the Exodus, then you don't have a consistent narrative. Or if the cities were destroyed hundreds of years apart from each other, then the story falls apart. In archaeology, the proper dating of cities, artifacts, and events is crucial. And most of the time, stuff from Egypt and Canaan from the late Bronze Age onwards can usually be accurately dated with a very small margin of error of about a few decades or less. So when a creationist organization finds bits of evidence that seem to fit their biblical beliefs, but they don't tell you when it dates to, be cautious because there is bias at play. Or when they pretend like it fits the right time period by making the time window so huge that everything fits in it.
What's more, the bones from these graves date from the Old Testament era.
Are you serious? It dates to the time of the Old Testament?
Wow.
That's a 4,000-year window. That's the equivalent of arguing that Julius Caesar could have met Queen Elizabeth because they both lived during the Holocene epic.
It's too...
Elizabeth.
Come on, man, I know she's old, but she ain't that old.
Let's take an objective look, though, and see if the archaeological evidence that we find in modern-day Israel matches the biblical story of the conquest of Canaan, and see if the dating of these towns, events, and objects fits the biblical timeline. According to the Bible, God told the Israelites to completely wipe out everyone in Canaan, and Joshua 12 records the Israelites facing off against the armies of 31 kings of major Canaanite cities listed by name whom the Israelites allegedly conquered. And there's a problem with this. Whether you put the Exodus in the 1400s or the 1200s, this large-scale destruction of Canaanite cities by a massive Israelite army doesn't bear out in the archaeological record.
Of the 31 sites said in the biblical narratives to have been taken, that is, overrun or conquered by invading Israelites, only 2 or 3 show any sign of destructions at the requisite Late Bronze Iron One age transition. Bethel shows the destruction at this time, followed by a presumably Israelite squatter occupation, but the excavation and publication were too poor to be precise. Tel Zayit also has a major destruction at the end of the Late Bronze Age, which might be attributed to Israelite invaders, but only if the site could be identified confidently with biblical Ziklag, and that's problematic. To make a long story short, today, not a single mainstream biblical scholar or archaeologist any longer upholds biblical archaeology's conquest model. Not one.
So how do creationists and biblical literalist French scholars get around this? Well, this passage says that Joshua defeated these kings, but it doesn't outright say that he destroyed their cities. So Ted Wright with the Associates for Biblical Research, who has a bachelor's in archaeology and a master's in mental gymnastics, in Christian apologetics, has this to say.
When you read the biblical account of the conquest, there are only 3 major cities that the Bible states that Joshua and the armies of Israel destroyed. There was Jericho, of course, and then the second city was the city of Ai, and the third city was a city called Hatzor.
Except that couldn't be further from the truth. You see, before entering the Promised Land, God has Moses command the Israelites to wipe out all the inhabitants of Canaan. They're told to slaughter every man, woman, and child, conquer their cities, and seize their land. After a detailed description of the destruction of Jericho and Ai, the Bible describes the complete and total destruction of the cities of Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, and Hatzor. It mentions them by name, saying they conquered each of these cities and put everyone in them to the sword. And before that, it says that they utterly destroyed 60 fortified cities with high walls, gates, and bars in the region of Bashan. They wiped out numerous other walled villages there and did the same thing to every single town and city in the area of Heshbon. It's a lot of crazy names, but bear with me. So we're already at over 69 utterly destroyed strongholds according to the Bible, and we're just getting started. You see, Joshua 10 goes on to describe how the Israelites conquered the whole region, sweeping through the hill country, desert, foothills, and mountains, totally destroying all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded. All these kings and their lands Joshua conquered in one campaign. Joshua 11 describes how all of the kings came out battle against them, a huge army as numerous as the sands on the seashore. The Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, they defeated them until no survivors were left.
No survivors? Then where do the stories come from, I wonder?
And after defeating these kings, Joshua took all of these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened the hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them more totally, exterminating them without mercy. Just how many cities did they conquer and exterminate according to the Bible? Well, most of the rest of the book of Joshua describes in great detail how the land and various towns and villages were divided among the tribes of Israel. And if you add up the numbers, you get at least 300 cities as like a bare minimum. How do I know that exactly? Well, let's just say that I spent quite some time sifting through all of these chapters, snipping out all of the parts that mention the cities and the territories that are divvied up, and I put it all in one document and tallied them up, making sure to remove duplicates.
When you read the biblical account of the conquest, there are only 3 major cities that the Bible states that Joshua and the armies of Israel destroyed.
This dude's off by a factor of 100. But even the 3 that he handpicks as his proof are problematic, even to other creationists like the Egyptologist Dr. David Falk.
How associates of biblical research gets around this problem, they don't actually engage the problem. They sort of subvert the problem. For Jericho, what they did was have Bryant Wood redo a typology, claim that the Middle Bronze fortifications were burned around 1400 BC, a statement that no credible archaeologist will back. As far as Ai, Associates for Biblical Research wasn't satisfied with the current identification of Ai, so they went hunting around for cities looking for one that fit an early Exodus bill. So it was a archaeological expedition in search for a result. If you already know what your conclusion is, boy, you're going to have some pretty screwy results at the end of that. And there's still no definitive proof that what ABR discovered as Ai is indeed Ai. As far as Hatzor, Douglas Petrovich writes a paper basically saying that there was a 1400 BC destruction and fallow period at Hatzor. When the Cypriot ware that we find there shows constant occupation through that period, the Amarna letters also tell us it was occupied by Canaanites during that period. They're just making up this data from whole cloth to get.
And this isn't anti-religious propaganda. Dr. Falk himself is a creationist. He's a rare breed of fringe Egyptologist who actually believes in the literal Exodus and Conquest of Kanan, just at a later date, albeit with smaller numbers and a non-literal interpretation of biblical genealogies and dates. Here's some of his evidence for the late date Conquest of Kanan.
And what do we find in the real archaeology of Hatzor and Jericho? Basically destruction layers that date to 1200 BC. The one at Hatzor is very well documented, very well recorded. It was pristine archaeology. The one at Jericho was recorded by Kathleen Kenyon and has recently been confirmed by the archaeological work of Lorenzo Nigro. So that pretty much settles that question.
Except that it doesn't. Not even remotely. For starters, he completely glossed over Ai, but Hatzor is pretty much all they have.
Hatzor was indeed violently destroyed, but the acting field director, Sharon Zuckerman, thinks that this was due to internecine warfare.
What about Jericho? What did Kathleen Kenyon actually find?
Distinguished British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Kenyon established 50 years ago that the walls of Jericho were destroyed many centuries before Joshua's time. probably by earthquakes, and that there was virtually nothing there in the Conquest era.
That's a bit of an overstatement by the History Channel. She did actually find some evidence that Jericho was sparsely re-inhabited after its 1550 BC destruction, but it appears to have been a tiny settlement during Falk and Wright's dates for Joshua, and was nothing like the massive, powerful city of its glory years, or like how the Bible describes it during Joshua's conquest. Falk then cites Lorenzo Nigro's more recent work as confirmation, but the paper that he cites barely even mentions this time period other than to say how sparse our finds from it are. And if you keep reading, Nigro even includes a section on the problems with the biblical Joshua narrative. Sure, a small mud brick wall was patched together on top of the ruins of the massive limestone wall of its glory years, but when asked about this wall in 2019, Nigro had this to say on the matter.
Have you found any walls from the 13th or 12th century?
This is, I think that the Germans have found a wall of the late bronze, but I don't think it's of the 13th or 12th century. This is earlier. The latest evidence in the late bronze is about 1400 BC. This is the only things that we could find.
There was no wall in the 13th century?
Up to now, nobody has found this wall. The site you have seen that is been extensively excavated. There is no wall at that time or at the alleged time of the life of Joshua.
I've been emailing with Dr. Nigro for clarity on this date because Falk made it sound like there was some new discovery in 2020 that I appear to somehow be overlooking. I'll pin a comment below with an update from him once I have one. But even if there is a mud brick wall at this time period, the biblical description of a grand, powerful, fortified city comes up short the moment that your trowel hits the dirt. In summary, all of the excavations given by both Wright and Falk are problematic. And what's more, neither of them address the over 300 cities that the Bible claims Joshua exterminated in a small 5-year window. And yes, you heard that right. A 5-year window. The Bible says exactly how old one of the generals, Caleb, is at the start and end of this massive genocidal campaign. So even if all of these cities were inhabited at this time period, they weren't. And even if they were all large important cities at this time, they weren't. And even if we found destruction in all of these cities, they'd literally have to have all been destroyed at almost exactly the same time. But what do we see instead at the few cities that were destroyed around this time?
With the advances in dating, in chronology, we have a very clear view today of the destruction of the city-states of Canaan at the end of the Bronze Age. And this destruction took about a century, if not a century and a half. If we pull back to the earlier site, Hatzor, we are somewhere in the middle of the 13th century. And then if we turn from Hatzor to the site that two of us are excavating at Megiddo, over there, the final blow, the final destruction of the city is sometimes close to 1100 BC.
If you just show up in Canaan and start looking for cities destroyed around this time period, you're gonna get some hits. But even in relatively peaceful times, the cities and settlements throughout Canaan were constantly squabbling and were attacked by internal and external forces. We know from diplomatic correspondences with Egypt called the Amarna letters that many of these city-states squabbled among themselves. We know that at the end of the Bronze Age, there was a major long-lasting drought, and some cities were abandoned due to water shortages or were raided while in their weakened state. And we have evidence that various people from the Mediterranean Sea settled on the western coast and fought battles throughout the Near East. The final nail in the coffin is that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Egypt controlled this region as part of its empire for pretty much this entire time period, periodically sweeping through and crushing rebellions. They had a strong garrison as far north as Beth Shean and occupied this area all the way up to as late as 1140 BCE. That's after even the latest date most biblical scholars argue for the conquest of Canaan. I've already covered that in past videos though. But who cares about all of this? I mean, aside from people who actually care about the truth, why does it matter if the Exodus and conquest of Canaan is historical or not? Well, it's because of slimy organizations like the Associates for Biblical Research that cherry pick the evidence and ignore the context that your average run-of-the-mill evangelical will ignorantly claim that everything in the Bible is backed up by evidence. And how can you blame them? These seem like legit archaeologists. But then again, this guy looks like a doctor. They then treat the Bible as literal and historical and are firmly convinced that it should be followed literally, not just by them, but oftentimes used to put policies in place that affect all of the rest of us. In fact, a literal historical reading of this story is why there's so much needless violence in Israel and Palestine today. Religious literalism is why there will never be a successful two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. This region is a geopolitical tinderbox waiting to go off, with Jewish fundamentalists literally believing that God gave them this land as their birthright over 3,000 years ago.
I think that the Jews should get land here, like the Bible says that each Jew, when Yeshua came with the Jews to Israel, each one got his own plot of land. So I think that each Jew should get his own plot of land, and non-Jews shouldn't.
Why do you steal more and more Palestinian land?
Why what?
Do you Israelis or Jews, steal more and more Palestinian land?
Okay, because we're not stealing, it's ours. It was our birthright in the Torah. God gave it to us, and it's our land, and we were here. And the fact that we were thrown out doesn't mean it wasn't ours, and it's ours because it's our given God right.
So rather than coexisting peacefully, they continue trying to push out the Palestinians who've been living there for centuries.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
So your position here is a political position to keep Palestinians out of it.
Not to keep Palestinians out of it, to keep Jews in it.
And therefore keep the Palestinians who were here out of it.
No, that's not, no. That's a necessary evil.
Meanwhile, the third most holy site in Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, is built directly on top of the destroyed Jewish temple, leaving Jews with nothing but a wall to wail at. So they fight and squabble, kill and bomb each other, while over 4 billion foreign Christians and Muslims look on, acting as if it's only other people's religions that are the problem, while each religion's most radical fringe sits on the edges, stoking the apocalyptic fire. I don't expect everyone who watches my videos to become an atheist, nor would I want you to change your mind over just one video. But for God's sake, can we please stop treating these texts like every single word is literal history written by a perfect God whose farts don't smell? Sure, there are elements in the Bible that are historical, but when you stop and actually critically examine the archaeological evidence, you discover that especially the earlier stories in the Bible cannot be taken literally. And that's where you find that nothing fails like Bible history. But unlike Bible history, Alex DeWitt succeeds at everything, including winning this last month's book raffle. Congratulations! I'll be including a personal note and reaching out to you on Twitter for an address to send it to in the coming days. If the rest of y'all would like to participate in this next month's book raffle, sponsored by Anthony Guthrie, for a chance to win the book Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery by Dr. Joshua Bowen, you can enter for a chance to win by liking this video, following me on Twitter at Holy Koolaid, and tweeting out a link to this video with the hashtag Nothing Fails Like Bible History. I'll put a link to both books below. If you enjoyed this video and appreciate the work that I do, you can show your support by making a per video pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Every little bit helps. Thank you all so much for your ongoing support, and as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.